The 9-year-old girl pushed the untouched water glass away, looking straight at the woman across the table. "Mom said you tried to sell her house before the funeral." The restaurant noise vanished. Helen, wearing a dress 2 sizes too big, felt the blood drain from her face, the faint smell of jasmine suddenly sickening. Marcus, the single father, didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed slightly, betraying nothing. His large hand closed around Lily's small arm, not in anger but restraint. This wasn't a blind date. It was an ambush masked by bad appetizers and forced smiles. Helen knew then. The father hadn't sought romance. He was looking for something he desperately needed to destroy. Helen retreated into the grey anonymity of her apartment building on the west side. The air inside the third-floor unit always felt dense and slightly chilled, even in late August. She moved through the rooms with a minimum of sound, a habit ingrained from years of occupying space that wasn't truly her own. Her apartment was immaculate, not due to pride, but due to a fear of clutter. Clutter meant history, and history meant pain. The wooden floors were bare, save for one worn rug that had belonged to her sister, Sarah. Helen rarely looked at it, stepping carefully around the frayed edges near the sofa. Sarah had been gone for 4 months, leaving behind the small house, a sizable debt, and the complication named Lily. Helen sat down on the edge of the stiff, oatmeal-colored sofa. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long, stark shadows across the empty walls. She worked as a remote data analyst, a job perfectly suited to her need for isolation and precision. Numbers never lied. People always did. On the small, minimalist coffee table sat a stack of unopened mail regarding Sarah's estate, mostly aggressive final notices, and resting on top, the business card of a real estate agent. She stared at it, the faint guilt she felt competing fiercely with the cold, hard logic of necessity. The house was a drain, and she was drowning. She stood and walked to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water that tasted faintly of copper. In the hall mirror, her reflection was indistinct. Helen was 42, a geography of sharp edges and muted colors. She wore functional clothes, her hair pulled back tightly, avoiding anything that might draw attention. Once her sister had called her the quiet wall. Helen hadn't argued. Walls were built to protect what was inside, even if what was inside was just a vast, echoing silence. The weight of Lily's accusation from the restaurant, the cold, direct threat it implied, settled heavy in her chest. She had agreed to the date only because Marcus, the father, had specifically mentioned discussing the estate. She needed to understand the lay of the land before she made the next move. Now she knew. They saw her as the vulture. She wondered if they were entirely wrong. The next morning, Marcus was stacking crates behind the Daily Grind, a perpetually busy coffee shop he managed near the university campus. His shoulders were wide, covered in a faded grey t-shirt that smelled faintly of roasted beans. He was 38, his face etched with the exhaustion only constant vigilance brings, but his movements were efficient, economical. He wasn't seeking pity, he was just functioning. Lily, his daughter, sat on an overturned milk crate nearby, meticulously organizing a pile of slightly squashed bottle caps she had salvaged. She wore mismatched sneakers and a determined frown, her focus absolute. Lily didn't talk much, especially not since the move 6 months ago, after her mother left them for a quieter life in a different state. The outburst at the restaurant last night had been the most vocal she had been in weeks. Marcus had scolded her gently on the way home, not for the substance of the accusation, which he had instigated, but for the lack of manners. He was teaching her strategy, not kindness. A delivery driver, sweaty and complaining about traffic, dropped a box too heavy for the narrow space. Marcus didn't wait for an apology. He simply stabilized the box, checked the inventory sheet, and signed off. "Thanks, John. Need a cold water before you head out?" Marcus asked, pulling a bottle from a cooler. John, the driver, paused, wiping his brow. "You know, Marcus, you're the only manager who ever asks that." "It's 90 degrees, man," Marcus replied, handing him the bottle. "Drink up." He went back to work, cleaning the grease trap cover. Lily looked up from her bottle caps. "She looked sad, Dad," she mumbled, referring to Helen. Marcus stopped scrubbing. "Who, sweetie?" "The auntie. She didn't touch her food, only the olives. She was concentrating on the conversation, Lil. He didn't want Lily to think about Helen. Helen was the collateral damage of a necessary investigation. He needed to know if Sarah's sister was a threat to the guardianship he was fighting for, but Lily's observation felt sharp, slicing through his careful cynicism. Marcus rinsed his hands and picked up a broom. The practical kindness he showed the driver, the simple act of acknowledging human needs, was the core of how he operated. He hadn't sought Helen out for a relationship. He sought her out because she held the key to the estate Sarah had vaguely promised him would help him raise Lily. He just didn't expect her to look quite so breakable. Gostaria de saber de onde você está assistindo a esta história. Comente abaixo. 2 days later, Helen received a single, thick envelope in the mail. It wasn't the expected legal threat or bill. Inside was a hand-drawn map of Sarah's neighborhood and a small typewritten note. I have the house keys. Meet me at 1800 outside 412 Maple Street. Bring the estate documents. No games. It was signed simply M. The bluntness irritated her, yet it was honest. Marcus wasn't hiding behind lawyers or polite jargon. He was a man who preferred dealing in tangible facts. Helen arrived exactly at 6. Maple Street was lined with old oaks and houses that needed painting, but felt loved. Number 412 was Sarah's house, and it looked abandoned, the porch furniture covered in dust sheets. Marcus was already there, leaning against his battered pickup truck, which had a faded "Support Local Coffee" sticker peeling off the bumper. Lily was sitting in the truck bed, sketching furiously in a large spiral notebook. "You're punctual," Marcus noted, his voice flat. He didn't offer a greeting, moving straight to business. The locks were changed after Sarah passed. She was worried about security. Helen handed him the legal file. They stood on the cracked driveway, the silence stretching between them, until the only sound was the rustle of the oak leaves. Marcus quickly scanned the summary of the estate debts, his expression unreadable. "She told me she had insurance, that everything was covered," Marcus said, his voice low. "Sarah was an optimist," Helen replied dryly. "The policy lapsed 6 months ago. She mortgaged the house twice." Lily dropped her notebook and it slid onto the driveway. Helen instinctively bent to retrieve it. Before Marcus could stop her, she saw the drawing, a detailed rendering of the restaurant table from 2 nights ago. Lily had drawn Helen with oversized, sad eyes and a halo of chaotic, wild hair, the absolute opposite of Helen's usual controlled appearance. "Give me that," Marcus said quickly, taking the notebook with a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. "It's fine," Helen murmured, straightening up. "She sees things." Instead of demanding to know her plans, Marcus looked at the porch. "I need to get some tools out of the shed before I finalize anything with the bank. Can you wait 15 minutes? It wasn't a question, but a simple statement of purpose. Helen, who had planned to leave immediately after the document exchange, found herself nodding. Marcus walked around the house. Lily, now sitting silently, looked at Helen. She pulled a half-eaten lollipop from her pocket and wordlessly held it out. Helen hesitated, then took it. "Thank you, Lily." It was a truce, sticky and imperfect, forged not in shared goals, but in the mundane acceptance of waiting together. The solitude Helen usually carried felt momentarily lighter, edged out by the sticky sweetness and the sound of a distant hammer blow. While Marcus worked in the backyard shed, Helen leaned against the truck, sucking on the overly sweet lollipop. The sun dipped lower, painting the suburban street in harsh oranges and pinks. Lily had returned to sketching, occasionally peering over the edge of the truck bed, her small head barely clearing the metal railing. Helen felt a dull ache behind her eyes, the exhaustion of maintaining constant emotional distance. Her gaze drifted to a narrow gap between the fence posts leading into the overgrown backyard. Lying in the mud, half buried, was a tarnished silver locket. It was instantly recognizable. She walked slowly toward it, pushing aside the brittle, dry weeds. The locket was small, oval, and engraved with the initials H.S., Helen Swanson. She picked it up, wiping the dirt away with the hem of her sleeve. This locket wasn't hers because it hadn't belonged to her. It belonged to the girl she was supposed to be. When Helen was 7, her parents, practical, successful people who valued order above all, went on a business trip that lasted 3 months. Sarah, 4 years older, had been their mother's favorite, deemed responsible enough to look after the quiet younger sister. Before leaving, their mother gave Sarah a matching locket, emphasizing that they were sisters, bound together. She hadn't given Helen one. Later that week, Sarah's locket broke. Helen, desperate for the same symbol of permanence, took an old costume jewelry locket, scratched the initials onto it with a sewing needle, and wore it under her shirt, showing no one. When their parents returned, happy and rested, their mother noticed the cheap jewelry peeking out. "Where did you get that trash, Helen?" she had asked, her voice laced with sharp disappointment. Helen had lied, saying she found it. Her mother had taken it immediately and thrown it into the garbage bin outside, citing the importance of quality over counterfeit sentiment. The core memory wasn't the rejection of the cheap locket, but the swift, casual removal of the symbol of her manufactured belonging. She hadn't cried. She simply learned that trying to claim affection was messy and ended badly. She never tried again. The locket in her hand, Sarah's lost, damaged one, was likely a replacement her sister had later bought, trying to repair the invisible fracture in their childhood. It was meaningless now, just metal and mud, but it affirmed the constant truth. She had always been on the outside, observing the family that she couldn't fully join. Marcus emerged from the shed, hauling a heavy toolbox. He looked at Helen, who was frozen with the dirt-caked locket in her palm. "Found something?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "Nothing important," Helen said, closing her hand around it tightly. She put it in her dress pocket, unwilling to let it go a second time. The logistics of the estate demanded coordination. Marcus was struggling to repair critical damage to the roof before the bank foreclosed, hoping to buy time. Helen, with her precise mind for budgeting and bureaucracy, volunteered to help manage the timeline. It wasn't kindness, it was efficiency. She hated loose ends. Soon, her routine formed. Helen would arrive at Sarah's house around 5 after finishing her remote workday. Marcus would be finishing up construction, sawdust coating his hair and clothes. Lily would be either reading or drawing on the porch swing, utterly silent, her presence a steady, anchoring weight. Helen didn't offer physical labor. She sat at the dusty dining table, reviewing permits and calling contractors, systematically dismantling the tangle of Sarah's financial mess. Marcus would bring her coffee, black and strong, without being asked. One evening, Marcus was struggling to hold a ladder steady while hammering a loose gutter bracket. Helen watched him, her brow furrowed with calculation. She walked over, not to take the hammer, but to brace the base of the ladder, placing her hands firmly on the metal feet. "You need to hold it level," she instructed, her voice low. "If you twist too much, the weight shifts." Marcus looked down, surprised by her proximity and her practical suggestion. He adjusted his stance immediately. "Thanks." It was the longest continuous conversation they had about anything unrelated to mortgages or liens. Lily, watching from the swing, rarely spoke to Helen directly, but her silent observation intensified. If Helen was cold, Lily would slide her own faded, oversized cardigan off her shoulders and place it on the nearest chair, a non-verbal offering. If Helen finished a task, Lily would pull a slightly wrinkled chocolate bar from her pocket, split it unevenly, and hand Helen the larger half. Helen never asked why Lily had accused her at the restaurant, nor did Marcus apologize for the setup. The silence wasn't awkward. It was a necessary container for their shared temporary purpose. Helen found herself staying later each day. The sterile silence of her own apartment now felt abrasive compared to the simple working quiet of Sarah's dilapidated house, filled with the scent of old wood and fresh sawdust. One evening, as Helen gathered her papers, she looked at the mess, tools scattered, paint cans open, Marcus wiping sweat from his forehead. It felt messy, unpredictable, and strangely safe. Marcus caught her eye. "Need anything for dinner?" he asked. It was a simple question, a neighborly courtesy. Helen paused, calculating the distance to her own quiet dinner alone. "No, but I can finish that contractor spreadsheet tonight." She was declining the invitation but extending the time she would stay tethered to them. She didn't realize she was staying because, For the first time in decades, she wasn't just observing a family. She was an essential, functioning piece of it. The fragile routine shattered during a rainy Friday afternoon. The roof repairs were nearing completion, largely thanks to Helen's fierce negotiation with the materials supplier. Marcus was lifting a heavy stack of dry lumber into the garage, while Helen organized Sarah's old storage boxes in the dusty living room. Lily was drawing on the floor nearby, humming a tuneless, quiet melody. Helen opened a small cedar box marked Important Documents. Inside, she found a life insurance policy, not lapsed but fully paid up, naming a distant cousin as the sole beneficiary. Sarah had lied to Marcus about the insurance, about everything. The policy was substantial, enough to pay off the mortgages and save the house. Helen stared at the paperwork, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. Sarah hadn't been an optimist. She had been a planner who favored chaos. She had deliberately left Marcus and Lily vulnerable, promising help she had directed elsewhere. Just then, Marcus returned, wiping plaster dust from his hands. He saw the open cedar box and the pale green insurance forms. "What is that?" he asked, stepping closer. Helen lifted the paper, her voice flat, devoid of accusation, but heavy with finality. "This is a paid life insurance policy. It covers the house and the debts. You are not the beneficiary." Marcus frowned, his body instantly tensing. "She told me. She swore if anything happened, it would cover us. It was for Lily's future." "She named a cousin in Arizona," Helen stated, placing the policy back down. "Sarah never named you, Marcus. Not officially." The sound of Lily's crayon scraping the hardwood floor stopped abruptly. Marcus felt a familiar, sickening sensation of betrayal wash over him. The same sharp twist he felt when Lily's mother packed her bags and left the city without a forwarding address. He looked at Helen, the calm, logical conduit of the bad news. "And you just found this now?" he challenged, his voice rising, the exhaustion making him reckless. "After all the time you spent here, why did you wait until the last minute? Were you waiting for the cousin to claim it so you could avoid the work? So you could finally justify selling the house when the bank took it?" Helen flinched, not at the volume, but at the accusation of deliberate malice. She wasn't a hero, but she wasn't a vulture either. "I found it 2 minutes ago. I was organizing the boxes." "Organizing?" Marcus spat, his pain twisting into unfair judgment. "You've been here, watching us struggle, knowing this house was the only stable thing Lily had left, and you were just organizing. You still want to sell it, don't you? That's why you brought the realtor's card to the date. You were just waiting for us to fail." He had misinterpreted her silence, her careful reserve, as cold calculation. He had used her past intention, her realistic assessment of the debt, as proof of her current guilt. Helen felt the sting of rejection, sharp and familiar. This was why she built walls. When you let people in, they eventually found the weak spot and drove the nail in. "The house is yours, Marcus," Helen said, gathering her papers and shoving them into her briefcase. Her hands were shaking slightly. "The policy pays the debt. I don't need your gratitude or your suspicions. I just needed to close the file." She looked down at Lily, whose small face was tight with worry. Helen didn't offer comfort or a goodbye. She simply turned and walked out, leaving the sound of the rain and Marcus's heavy, regretful breathing behind her. The safety had been an illusion, broken by 2 minutes of exposed, painful truth. Helen didn't go home. She drove to a diner, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and sat with the life insurance policy spread out on the table. The anger in Marcus's eyes was a visceral image she couldn't shake. He saw her as the perpetual threat, the relative who benefited from distance and emotional coldness. The fact that the house was saved by Sarah's reckless planning didn't erase the 4 months of crippling debt Marcus had carried, nor the weeks of physical labor he had put in, fueled by a promise that was a lie. Sarah's cousin, named Beatrice, was located in Scottsdale, a woman Helen faintly remembered meeting once at a wedding 2 decades ago. Beatrice had no connection to Lily. Helen knew she could simply mail the policy and walk away. Her job was done. The debt was zeroed out. Marcus had the house. She had proven her competence and could return to her quiet, controlled life. But the image of Lily, drawing silently on the floor, her face crumpled in confusion when her father yelled, kept pulling Helen back. Lily had offered her the lollipop. She had shown Helen the messy comfort of belonging. Helen made a call. The call was professional, concise, and focused on logistics. She introduced herself to Beatrice, outlined the estate, and confirmed the policy. Beatrice, a paralegal herself, was sympathetic but firm. The money was hers according to the documents. Helen didn't argue. She drove home, pulled out her own financial statements, and spent the night running aggressive calculations. She didn't have the amount of the policy, but she had substantial liquid savings. She was a meticulous saver, driven by the fear of ever needing to rely on anyone. The next morning, Helen contacted her own long-term lawyer. Her instruction was simple. She wanted to execute a high-interest loan to Beatrice, securing the bulk of the insurance payout, which would immediately be directed to a newly created trust fund for Lily's education. She structured the deal to ensure Beatrice received a reasonable, immediate cash payment, while the rest was legally redirected to protect the minor child, arguing the intent of the deceased. It was an audacious move, legally complex and personally risky, requiring her to empty her accounts and place herself in significant debt. Helen did it not for Marcus, but for the quiet girl who saw sadness in her eyes. It was the only way to solidify the ground beneath Lily's feet, ensuring the security Marcus fought for wouldn't rely entirely on Sarah's volatile past. She acted swiftly. By midday, the papers were drawn up, signed, and the money transfer was initiated. Helen sought no acknowledgement. Marcus would never know she had incurred personal risk to ensure Lily's future went beyond the fixed assets of a repaired house. This was protection, silent and absolute, the choice of someone who finally understood what it meant to belong to a purpose greater than solitude. 2 weeks passed in complete silence. Helen's apartment was clean, her spreadsheets were perfect, but the air felt too thin. She was consumed by the professional anxiety of her massive new debt, yet it was surprisingly manageable because the financial fear was overshadowed by a deeper, unfamiliar emptiness. One Tuesday evening, the silence was broken not by a call, but by a knock at her door, a hesitant, quiet tap. Helen opened the door to find Marcus standing there. He wasn't holding tools or financial papers. He looked worn, his jaw tight, holding a chipped ceramic mug. Beside him, Lily clutched a spiral notebook, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. "I know the house is paid off," Marcus started, his voice rough. "The bank confirmed it. And the lawyer, he mentioned a trust fund established for Lily, anonymous contribution. But he said the documentation was handled by someone who knew the estate intimately." He didn't need to elaborate. The quiet control and complicated legal maneuvering screamed Helen. He held out the mug. "This is Sarah's favorite mug. I found it in a box. I cleaned it." Helen took the mug. It was warm, heavy, and smelled faintly of cinnamon. It was a peace offering, fragile and practical. "I called Beatrice," Marcus admitted, his gaze finally meeting hers. "She said you were incredibly persuasive, that you convinced her to let the money go toward the child's future instead of her retirement condo. She said you didn't ask for a single thing in return. I was wrong, Helen. I accused you of waiting for us to fail. I was projecting my fear." Helen simply nodded. She didn't accept the apology eagerly, nor did she minimize his mistake. She accepted the fact of it. The silence that followed stretched, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was heavy with mutual understanding and exhaustion. Lily shuffled her feet, then looked up at Helen. She held out the notebook, open to a fresh page. The drawing was simple. 3 stick figures standing on a newly painted porch. They weren't smiling, but they were touching shoulders. "The roof doesn't leak anymore," Lily announced, her voice small and clear. "You fixed the numbers, so Dad fixed the roof." It was the most direct statement of connection any of them had made. Helen looked at the drawing, then back at Marcus. She realized she hadn't fixed the numbers for Sarah, or for her own sense of completion. She had done it for the quiet possibility of that shared space. "It's good that the roof is finished," Helen said softly, gripping the warm mug. Marcus relaxed his shoulders slightly. "We're making pasta. You don't have to stay, but—" "I like pasta," Helen interrupted, the words escaping before she could retract them into safe silence. Marcus took a half step back, creating space for her choice. He didn't push. He just waited. Helen followed them back to Maple Street. Sarah's house, which had once felt like a monument to debt and grief, was now alive. The porch light was warm yellow, illuminating a freshly swept area. Inside, the lingering scent of sawdust was mixed with the sharper aroma of garlic and basil. Marcus was an excellent cook, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who fed others for a living. Lily sat at the newly varnished kitchen table, setting out 3 mismatched plates. She placed the plates down with deliberate precision, ensuring the fork and spoon were exactly parallel on each side. Helen hung her functional jacket on the back of a chair. She didn't help with the cooking. She wasn't useful there. Instead, she took out the cedar box, which she had carried in her briefcase, and retrieved the tarnished silver locket. "Lily," Helen called quietly. Lily turned, chewing slowly on the corner of her tongue. Helen held out the locket, the small scratched HS barely visible. "Your mother gave this to me when I was little. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours." Lily stepped closer, examining the piece of metal. She didn't ask questions about the initials or the history. She simply held out her hand, and Helen placed the locket, cold and heavy, into her palm. "It needs a new chain," Lily observed practically. "We can find one," Helen agreed. Marcus placed a large bowl of steaming spaghetti on the table. The 3 of them sat down. They didn't talk about the money, the accusations, or the long-held pain. They talked about Lily's school project on tectonic plates and the excessive price of commercial-grade roofing screws. Midway through the meal, Lily leaned over and quietly nudged her plate of garlic bread toward Helen, an offering of shared sustenance. Marcus watched the exchange, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. He saw Helen, who usually moved with such guarded precision, now slightly disheveled, sauce on the side of her mouth, completely absorbed in the moment. She wasn't an auntie by definition, nor a stranger, nor a threat. She was simply present. As the dusk settled and the kitchen lights glowed softly, illuminating the 3 of them, the damaged man, the observant child, and the solitary woman, Helen felt the pressure in her chest ease. Family wasn't about blood or formal agreements. It was the choice to remain in the same warm light, sharing the bread and the silence. It was the simple decision not to walk away when the truth was painful, and the choice to protect someone else's fragile world before your own. Marcus watched Helen laugh quietly at one of Lily's observations, a genuine sound he hadn't thought her capable of making. He picked up his fork, ready for the easy, shared exhaustion of the evening. "Come back tomorrow, Helen," Marcus said, not as a request, but as a statement of fact. This is the end of the script, but the journey of human connection is just beginning. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, comment on the moment that resonated most with you, and subscribe to the channel for more high-retention cinematic narratives about the silent, beautiful struggle of humanity.